Route 40 Diner, somewhere outside Barstow, California, July 2019. The motorcycle gang had been making stops along this stretch of highway for 3 years, and every business owner who saw 30 Harleys pull into their parking lot knew what came next. Intimidation, demands for free food, threats if you refused. The Desert Reapers MC ran protection rackets across 4 counties, and their president, a man called Reaper, who'd done time for aggravated assault, made it clear that cooperation wasn't optional. When they rolled up to Dorothy Martinez's diner that scorching Tuesday afternoon, Reaper walked in, expecting the usual fear response. What he got instead was a 72-year-old woman in a flour-dusted apron who looked him dead in the eye and said 5 words that made his crew go silent. "You'll pay or you'll leave." What happened in the next 48 hours would expose a trafficking operation, save 6 lives, and prove that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a grandmother who survived things worse than you could imagine. If you value stories about courage showing up in unexpected forms, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it mattered most. Dorothy Martinez had owned the Route 40 diner for 43 years, ever since her husband Frank had built it with his own hands in 1976. The place sat on a lonely stretch of California highway between Barstow and Needles, serving truckers, tourists, and locals who appreciated Dorothy's homemade cinnamon rolls and her policy of never closing, not for holidays or weather or anything else. Frank had died in 1998, but Dorothy kept the diner running with the help of her daughter Maria and 2 part-time cooks. The building itself was nothing special. Aluminum siding, a gravel parking lot, a neon sign that said Dorothy's in red letters that had been flickering for a decade. Inside were 12 booths with red vinyl seats, a counter with 8 stools, and a kitchen that Dorothy ran with military efficiency despite equipment that should have been replaced years ago. The walls were covered with photos of customers, truckers who'd been stopping there for decades, families on road trips, even a few minor celebrities who'd stumbled across the place. What made Dorothy's diner special wasn't the building or the food, though the cinnamon rolls had a regional reputation. What made it special was Dorothy herself, a woman who'd immigrated from Mexico at 19, learned English from library books, and built a life through determination and work that never stopped. She'd raised 3 kids while running the diner, survived breast cancer at 64, and buried a husband she'd loved for 40 years. The diner was her legacy, her purpose, and the thing that kept her getting up at 4 a.m. every morning to start the ovens. The Desert Reapers had first appeared at the diner in 2016. A dozen bikes, guys in leather vests with patches that identified them as a 1% motorcycle club, the kind that operated outside the law and made their money through intimidation and illegal enterprise. Their first visit had been almost polite. They'd ordered food, eaten it. Then Reaper had approached Dorothy and explained how protection payments worked. "This is a lonely stretch of road," he'd said, leaning against her counter. "Accidents happen, fires, break-ins, equipment failures. We can make sure none of that happens to you. $500 a month cash and your place stays safe." Dorothy had been running a business on this highway for 40 years. She'd dealt with health inspectors, tax auditors, drunk customers, and once an attempted robbery by 2 kids high on meth. She'd also grown up in circumstances that made motorcycle gang intimidation look like amateur hour compared to the cartel violence she'd fled in Sinaloa. "No, thank you," she'd told Reaper. "I don't need protection. I need customers who pay for their food. Your bill is $47. Reaper had smiled like she'd said something amusing. "Lady, you don't understand how this works. The protection isn't optional. Neither is paying your bill. $47, or I call the sheriff." The standoff had lasted maybe 30 seconds before Reaper threw a $50 bill on the counter and walked out, his crew following. Dorothy had expected retaliation, vandalism or threats, but nothing happened for 6 months. Then the Reapers came back, tested her again with the same demand, and again Dorothy refused. This pattern repeated 4 times over 3 years, each visit escalating slightly in tension but never crossing into overt violence. What Dorothy didn't know was that the Reapers were using her diner as a test for new prospects. If a potential member could intimidate the old Mexican lady into paying protection, they'd proven themselves. If they couldn't, they weren't Reaper material. Dorothy's consistent refusal had become something of a legend in the club. The stubborn old woman who wouldn't break. On this particular Tuesday in July 2019, the Reapers arrived with their largest group yet. 30 bikes, including several prospects who were being evaluated for full membership. Reaper had decided it was time to make an example, to show his newer members how to handle resistance through escalation. The plan was simple: demand payment, and when Dorothy refused, begin destroying property until she complied. They filled the parking lot with their motorcycles, engines rumbling in a coordinated display of mechanical intimidation. Reaper entered first, followed by his road captain Snake and his enforcer, a massive man called Tiny who stood 6'6" and weighed close to 300 pounds. The rest of the crew filed in behind them, filling every booth and stool, creating a wall of leather and denim and hostile intent. Dorothy was behind the counter, pulling a tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven. Her daughter Maria was in the kitchen, visible through the service window. There were no other customers, which Reaper had planned by having prospects turn away anyone who tried to enter in the 20 minutes before the main group arrived. "Dorothy," Reaper said, his voice loud enough to carry through the diner, "we need to have another conversation about your business arrangement with us." Dorothy set down her tray and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Reaper with the same calm expression she'd worn during every previous encounter. "If you're here to eat, the menu's on the wall. If you're here to cause trouble, the door's behind you." Snake laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Old lady, you've got 30 of us here. You really think you're in a position to give orders? I think I'm the owner of this establishment, and you're a customer who hasn't ordered anything yet. So yes, I'm in a position to tell you how things work in my diner." Reaper had prepared several escalation strategies, but he hadn't anticipated Dorothy's complete lack of fear. Most people confronted by 30 bikers showed some kind of stress response, raised voices or nervous movement or attempts at placation. Dorothy just stood there waiting for them to order or leave, like this was a normal Tuesday afternoon. "Here's what's going to happen," Reaper said, shifting tactics. "You're going to give us all the food we want on the house. Then you're going to agree to weekly payments of $1,000, up from the $500 we were asking before because you've been difficult. And if you refuse, we're going to start breaking things until you change your mind." Dorothy considered this for a moment. Then she pulled out her cell phone from her apron pocket and dialed 911. She put the call on speaker so everyone in the diner could hear. "911, what's your emergency?" "This is Dorothy Martinez at the Route 40 diner, mile marker 47. I have 30 members of a motorcycle gang in my establishment, threatening to vandalize my property if I don't pay them protection money. I need sheriff's deputies here immediately." The diner went completely silent. In 3 years of testing Dorothy, the Reapers had never actually seen her call law enforcement. They'd assumed it was a bluff, that she was too proud or too scared to actually involve police. The reality of her calling 911 with all of them present created a calculation problem. If they left immediately, they looked weak. If they stayed and deputies arrived, they'd all be arrested for extortion. Reaper made his decision in about 5 seconds. "Let's go. This crazy old woman isn't worth the trouble." The crew started to file out, but Dorothy spoke again, her voice sharp enough to stop them. "The dispatcher is still on the line. Deputies are already en route. You'll pass them on the highway if you leave now. and they'll pull you over because I'm giving them your license plate numbers while we're talking. So here's what's actually going to happen. You're going to sit down, you're going to wait for the deputies to arrive, and you're going to explain to them why you thought threatening a 72-year-old woman was a good use of your time. Tiny took a step toward Dorothy, his hand raised in what could have been a threatening gesture. What happened next was so fast that most of the bikers didn't process it until it was over. Dorothy reached under the counter and came up with a Remington 870 shotgun, the same one Frank had kept there since 1976. She racked the slide with practiced efficiency and pointed it at Tiny's center mass. "I've been a clay shooting champion 3 times at the California state competition," Dorothy said calmly. "I can put both rounds in this gun through a target the size of a dinner plate at 50 feet. You're a lot bigger than a dinner plate, and you're a lot closer than 50 feet. Sit down or find out if I'm bluffing." Tiny sat down. So did everyone else. The dispatcher on the phone was asking if Dorothy was safe, if weapons had been drawn, if anyone was injured. Dorothy answered each question clearly while keeping the shotgun trained on Reaper, who was recalculating everything he'd assumed about this situation. Sheriff's deputies arrived 8 minutes later. 3 patrol cars with 6 deputies who'd been briefed en route that they were responding to an extortion attempt by a known motorcycle gang. What they found was 30 bikers sitting quietly in booths while an elderly woman held them at gunpoint and explained in precise detail what had been threatened. The lead deputy, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been working this area for 12 years, had to suppress a smile at the scene. She'd known Dorothy for years, knew about the repeated Reaper visits, and had been waiting for Dorothy to finally call for backup. "Dorothy, you can lower the shotgun now. We've got this." Dorothy set the gun on the counter, but didn't put it away. "These men came into my business and threatened to destroy my property if I didn't pay them protection money. I have witnesses. I have the 911 recording, and I have 30 suspects you can arrest right now." What happened next involved statements from Dorothy and Maria, license plate documentation of all 30 motorcycles, arrest warrants checked against outstanding charges, and 6 members of the Desert Reapers being taken into custody on various violations. Reaper himself had 2 outstanding warrants, one for assault and one for failure to appear on a previous charge. Snake had a warrant for parole violation. 4 prospects were arrested for possession when deputies found methamphetamine during searches incident to arrest. The rest were released with citations and warnings, their information documented in case this escalated into a larger investigation. Deputy Chen took detailed statements and photographs, building a case file that would support felony extortion charges against Reaper and his leadership. But the real story, the one that would change everything, emerged when Chen was interviewing Maria in the kitchen and noticed something odd. Maria kept glancing toward the walk-in freezer with an expression that looked like fear mixed with guilt. When Chen asked if something was wrong, Maria hesitated, then made a decision. "There's something you need to see, but if I show you, people are going to get hurt, maybe killed." Chen called for backup and obtained Maria's consent to search the premises. What they found in a hidden compartment beneath the walk-in freezer would expose an operation that had nothing to do with protection rackets and everything to do with why the Desert Reapers had really been visiting Dorothy's diner for 3 years. The hidden compartment beneath Dorothy's walk-in freezer had been installed in 1987, built by Frank Martinez during a renovation project. He designed it as a storm shelter, a place to hide if tornadoes threatened, which happened occasionally in this part of California, despite what people assumed about desert weather. The compartment was 8 feet by 10 feet, accessible through a floor panel that looked like part of the freezer's foundation. Frank had shown Dorothy and their kids where it was. Then over the years, everyone had mostly forgotten about it, as the threat of tornadoes never materialized. Maria had discovered someone was using it 3 months earlier, in April 2019, when she'd been cleaning the freezer and noticed the access panel was slightly misaligned. She'd opened it expecting to find evidence of rodents or water damage. What she found instead were supplies that didn't belong to the diner. Blankets, bottled water, canned food, a battery-powered lantern, and a notebook filled with dates and times and license plate numbers. She'd confronted her mother about it that night, asking if Dorothy knew someone was using their hidden shelter. Dorothy had gone pale when she saw the notebook, then sat Maria down and explained something she'd been hiding for 6 months. The Desert Reapers weren't just running protection rackets. They were moving people, mostly young women from Mexico and Central America, using legitimate-looking businesses along their route as temporary holding locations before transporting victims to final destinations in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Dorothy had discovered this by accident the previous November when she'd arrived at the diner at 3 a.m. to start baking and found Reaper's truck parked behind the building. She'd approached cautiously and heard voices speaking Spanish from somewhere near the storage area. Looking through a gap in the building's siding, she'd seen 3 young women, teenagers really, huddled together while Reaper and Snake discussed transport logistics. Dorothy had understood immediately what she was witnessing. She'd grown up in Sinaloa during the narco wars, had seen how cartels and criminal organizations operated, knew the signs of human trafficking that most Americans wouldn't recognize. These girls were being held against their will, transported like cargo, and the Desert Reapers were profiting from their suffering. What Dorothy did next was calculated and dangerous. Instead of calling police, which would have resulted in the girls being deported and the Reapers just moving their operation elsewhere, she'd started documenting everything. She'd installed a hidden camera in the storage area. She'd begun keeping detailed records of when the Reapers visited, how many bikes, who was present, patterns in their routes and timing. And she'd started using the hidden compartment beneath the freezer to store evidence, because keeping it in her home or anywhere else the Reapers might search was too risky. The notebook Maria had found contained 6 months of observations, license plate numbers, physical descriptions of Reaper leadership, and estimated dates when victims were moved through the area. Dorothy had been building a case file to hand to federal authorities, specifically ICE and the FBI, agencies with the resources and jurisdiction to actually dismantle the trafficking network rather than just arrest a few bikers on local charges. But she needed enough evidence to make prosecution certain, which meant documenting patterns over time rather than reporting a single incident. Maria had been horrified when Dorothy explained this. "Mom, these are dangerous people. If they find out you're documenting them, they'll kill you. If I report them now, they'll move their operation and those girls will still be trapped. I need enough evidence to destroy the whole network, not just inconvenience them." "You should have told me. I could have helped. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you in danger. But now that you know, I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, if the Reapers figure out what I'm doing, you take that notebook to the FBI field office in San Bernardino. Don't go to local police. Don't try to handle it yourself. FBI only." Maria had made that promise, and for 3 months she'd helped her mother document Reaper activity while trying not to think about what would happen if they got caught. The confrontation today, with Dorothy calling 911 and pulling a shotgun on 30 bikers, had terrified Maria because it meant the secret could come out before they were ready. Now, standing in the kitchen with Deputy Chen, Maria made the decision that her mother's safety mattered more than perfect evidence collection. She opened the freezer, moved aside a stack of frozen vegetable boxes, and revealed the access panel. Chen called for additional backup and a supervisor before opening the compartment, following protocol for evidence preservation. What they found was Dorothy's complete documentation of the Desert Reapers' trafficking operation, the notebook with 6 months of observations, the hidden camera's memory card with footage of victims being held in the storage area, photographs Dorothy had taken of license plates and faces, handwritten notes about routes and timing that showed an organized network moving victims every 2 to 3 weeks along a corridor from the Mexican border through California toward Las Vegas. Chen immediately recognized this was beyond local jurisdiction. She called her supervisor, Captain Mike Torres, who contacted the FBI's field office in San Bernardino. Within 2 hours, federal agents were at Dorothy's diner examining the evidence and interviewing Dorothy about what she'd witnessed. Special Agent Lisa Park, who led the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force for Southern California, sat across from Dorothy in one of the diner's booths and listened to the elderly woman describe 6 months of dangerous evidence gathering with an expression that mixed admiration and frustration. "Mrs. Martinez, what you've documented here is extraordinarily valuable. This is evidence that could dismantle a trafficking network we've been trying to penetrate for 2 years. But you also put yourself at tremendous risk by conducting this investigation alone. If the Reapers had discovered what you were doing, they would have killed me," Dorothy interrupted. "I know. I grew up around violence that makes motorcycle gangs look like children playing dress-up. I understood the risks. Why didn't you report what you saw when you first witnessed it?" "Because reporting one incident would have saved maybe 3 girls, and then the Reapers would move their route and keep trafficking. I wanted to give you enough evidence to destroy the entire operation and save all the future victims, not just the ones I could see." Park had worked trafficking cases long enough to understand Dorothy's logic, even if she couldn't officially endorse civilians conducting independent investigations of violent criminal organizations. The evidence Dorothy had gathered was exactly what the FBI needed: documented patterns and logistics that would support RICO charges and multi-state prosecution. "We're going to need to take you into protective custody," Park said. "The Reapers who were arrested today will make bail within 24 hours. When they do, Reaper will know something triggered the police response beyond just his extortion attempt. If he searches your diner and finds evidence that you've been documenting him for 6 months, he won't find anything because you're taking it all with you right now," Dorothy said. "And I've been preparing for this possibility since I started. My go-bag is in my truck. Maria knows to close the diner and stay with her sister in Arizona. I'm ready to disappear for however long it takes." The federal response moved quickly once Park confirmed Dorothy's evidence was legitimate. The FBI's Trafficking Task Force coordinated with ICE, the DEA, and local law enforcement across 4 states to build cases against not just the Desert Reapers, but the larger network they were part of. Dorothy's documentation provided the foundation that let investigators connect previously isolated incidents into a pattern of organized criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that the Reapers were subcontractors in a trafficking operation run by a cartel with connections in Sinaloa, the same region Dorothy had fled decades earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd escaped cartel violence in Mexico only to end up documenting cartel trafficking in California. Over the following 2 weeks, while Dorothy stayed in a safe house in San Bernardino, federal agents executed coordinated raids across California, Nevada, and Arizona. They arrested 47 individuals, including all of the Desert Reapers' leadership and several cartel members who'd been operating in the United States for years. They recovered 23 victims, all women between ages 14 and 28, who'd been held in various locations along the trafficking route. The victims' testimonies, combined with Dorothy's documentation and electronic evidence seized during the raids, built cases that would eventually result in federal trafficking convictions, carrying sentences of 25 years to life. Reaper himself, whose real name was Gerald Patterson, faced charges that included conspiracy to commit human trafficking, racketeering, and kidnapping. His trial would begin in 2021 and result in 3 consecutive life sentences. But the immediate aftermath created complications Dorothy hadn't fully anticipated. The Desert Reapers had connections to other criminal organizations who didn't appreciate losing a profitable trafficking route. Within a week of the raids, the FBI received credible threats against Dorothy from associates of the Sinaloa cartel who'd been using the Reapers as transport contractors. We can keep you in protective custody indefinitely," Agent Park told Dorothy during a meeting at the safe house. "But that's not a life. You'd have to relocate under witness protection, new identity, no contact with your family or friends. Is that something you're willing to do?" Dorothy had spent 3 days thinking about this possibility. She was 72 years old. Her husband was dead, her children were grown, and her legacy was a diner on a highway that had been contaminated by being used as a trafficking waypoint. Starting over with a new identity meant abandoning everything she'd built, but staying meant living under constant threat from people who'd proven they would kill witnesses. "I didn't survive narco-violence in Sinaloa, and 40 years running a business in the desert just to hide in a safe house for the rest of my life," Dorothy said. "But I'm also not stupid enough to think I can go back to my diner and pretend nothing happened. What are my realistic options?" Park laid out 3 possibilities. Option 1 was witness protection with full relocation and identity change. Option 2 was staying in protective custody until all trials concluded and threats were assessed as diminished, which could take years. Option 3 was a middle path, relocating to a different area without full identity change, with FBI monitoring and security precautions, but maintaining some connection to her previous life. Dorothy chose option 3, and in September 2019, she moved to Flagstaff, Arizona, where her daughter Maria had already relocated with her family. The Route 40. Diner was sold to a retired couple from Nevada who renamed it and had no idea about its history as a trafficking waypoint. Dorothy used the proceeds to buy a small bakery in Flagstaff, a modest operation that she ran with Maria's help. The transition was harder than she'd anticipated. Flagstaff felt crowded compared to the desert highway she'd known for 4 decades. The customers were different, tourists and college students rather than truckers and locals. And Dorothy struggled with the knowledge that her decision to investigate the Reapers, while resulting in dozens of arrests and victim recoveries, had also ended her previous life completely. But the letters started arriving about 4 months after the raids, forwarded through the FBI from victims who'd been recovered. Young women writing in Spanish to thank the abuela who documented their captivity and helped bring their traffickers to justice. Some of the letters included photographs, girls who'd been held in Dorothy's storage area, now reunited with their families in Mexico and Honduras and El Salvador. One letter came from a 17-year-old named Carmen, who'd been held in the storage area for 3 days in December 2018. She wrote that she'd heard Dorothy speaking Spanish to someone in the diner and had tried to call for help, but the Reapers had gagged her before she could make noise. She'd lost hope of rescue until FBI agents had raided the house in Las Vegas where she was being held, showing up with evidence that included Dorothy's photographs and timeline documentation. "You didn't know me," Carmen wrote. "You didn't know my name or my face, but you risked your life to help me and the other girls anyway. My mother says you are an angel sent by God. I just say thank you, and I will never forget what you did." Dorothy kept that letter in her wallet and read it whenever she felt regret about losing her diner and the life she'd built there. The victims were real, their freedom was real, and her decision to document rather than just report had resulted in a trafficking network being destroyed rather than just interrupted. The trials began in early 2020, with Dorothy testifying via secure video link rather than in person due to ongoing security concerns. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her testimony by painting her as a vigilante who'd conducted an illegal investigation. but prosecutors countered by showing that every piece of evidence Dorothy gathered was from observation of activity on her own property, making it admissible and legal. Reaper's defense strategy was to claim he'd been extorting Dorothy for protection money, but had no knowledge of trafficking operations being run by other Reaper's members without his authorization. This defense collapsed when prosecutors presented Dorothy's documentation showing Reaper personally present during victim transfers multiple times, combined with testimony from recovered victims who identified him as directly involved in their transport and captivity. The jury deliberated for 9 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Dorothy's role in building the case. Mrs. Martinez's courage in documenting this criminal enterprise at great personal risk has resulted in justice for 23 victims and the dismantling of an organization that would have continued trafficking indefinitely. Her actions represent the best of civilian cooperation with law enforcement, even if the methods were unconventional. The Flagstaff bakery Dorothy opened in late 2019 was a fraction of the size of her old diner, just 800 square feet, with seating for 12 customers and a kitchen barely large enough for the commercial ovens she needed. She called it Abuela's Kitchen, a name that felt right for this new chapter of her life. The menu was simple: cinnamon rolls, pan dulce, coffee, and a rotating selection of Mexican pastries that Dorothy had learned to make from her own grandmother 50 years earlier in Sinaloa. The bakery struggled at first. Flagstaff already had established bakeries and coffee shops, and Dorothy was starting from zero with no reputation and no customer base. She was 73 years old and learning to navigate a new city, new suppliers, new regulations, and a market that didn't automatically appreciate what she was offering. There were days during the first few months when she sold fewer than $20 worth of pastries and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving the desert highway she'd known for 4 decades. But gradually, word spread about the grandmother who made cinnamon rolls that tasted like someone's childhood memories of Mexico. College students from Northern Arizona University discovered the bakery and brought their friends. Locals who'd grown up eating pan dulce found Dorothy's versions reminded them of bakeries from their own hometowns. And Maria, working alongside her mother like she had at the diner, proved to be excellent at social media marketing, posting photos of fresh pastries that attracted the kind of attention no paid advertising could match. By summer 2020, Abuela's Kitchen had developed a following large enough that Dorothy was considering hiring additional help. The bakery was never going to make her rich, but it was sustainable and fulfilling in ways the diner had been before it became contaminated by association with trafficking. Dorothy could focus on baking and customers without constantly watching for threats or documenting criminal activity. The emotional recovery took longer than the business recovery. Dorothy had spent 6 months living with constant awareness that discovery would likely mean her death, documenting violence while pretending everything was normal, carrying knowledge of suffering she couldn't immediately stop. That kind of sustained stress didn't disappear just because the investigation had concluded successfully. She started having nightmares about 3 months after moving to Flagstaff. Vivid dreams where she was back at the diner and the Reapers discovered her hidden camera, or where she was trying to help trafficking victims escape but couldn't move or speak. She'd wake up at 2 a.m. with her heart racing, unable to fall back asleep, eventually just getting up to start baking, even though the bakery didn't open until 6 a.m. Maria recognized the signs of trauma and convinced Dorothy to see a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in PTSD and had experience working with trafficking survivors and witnesses. The therapy sessions were difficult at first because Dorothy had spent 73 years solving her own problems and didn't naturally trust talking to strangers about her feelings. But Dr. Chen approached the work from a practical angle that Dorothy could accept. You witness terrible things and put yourself in danger to stop them. Your body developed survival responses to keep you safe during that time. Now that the danger is past, your body doesn't know how to turn off those responses. We're going to teach it that you're safe now. The process took months and involved techniques Dorothy initially dismissed as silly, breathing exercises and progressive muscle relaxation and cognitive reframing of intrusive thoughts. But gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. The hypervigilance that made her constantly scan for threats in the bakery started to ease. She began sleeping through the night more often than not. The trials continued through 2020 and into 2021, with Dorothy testifying in 6 separate proceedings against different defendants in the trafficking network. Each testimony was conducted remotely from a secure facility in Flagstaff, with FBI agents present to ensure her safety. Defense attorneys tried various strategies to discredit her, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence or misunderstood what she'd witnessed, but the physical evidence and victim testimonies always corroborated her accounts. Gerald Reaper Patterson's trial was the most significant, both because of the severity of charges and because of the media attention it attracted. The case had everything journalists loved: a motorcycle gang, human trafficking, and an elderly grandmother who'd secretly investigated them. News outlets requested interviews with Dorothy, which she declined on FBI advice, but that didn't stop them from running stories based on court documents and testimony transcripts. The coverage was mostly positive, portraying Dorothy as a hero who'd risked everything to save trafficking victims. But some of it made her uncomfortable with how it simplified the moral complexities of what she'd done. Articles called her brave and selfless. But Dorothy knew her motivations had been more complicated than pure altruism. She'd been angry at seeing her property used for trafficking. She'd wanted to destroy the people who'd threatened her business. And yes, she'd wanted to help the victims, but that hadn't been her only reason for documenting the Reapers. "Does it matter what my motivations were if the result was good?" she asked Dr. Chen during one session. "It matters for your own peace of mind, Doctor." Chen replied, "You can acknowledge that you acted partly from self-interest and anger, while also recognizing that you did something genuinely heroic. People aren't simple. Motivations aren't simple. You can be both self-interested and selfless, angry and compassionate, scared and brave, all at the same time." The concept helped Dorothy process some of her complicated feelings about what had happened. She didn't need to be a perfect saint who acted purely from noble motivations. She could be an angry old woman who was sick of being threatened, and also someone who saved 23 lives. Both things were true. The letters from recovered victims continued arriving, forwarded through the FBI's Victim Services Office. By mid-2021, Dorothy had received correspondence from 18 of the 23 women who'd been rescued from the trafficking network. Some letters were brief thank you notes. Others were detailed accounts of what the women had experienced and what their lives looked like now that they were free. In Carmen, the 17-year-old who'd been held in Dorothy's storage area stayed in regular contact. She'd returned to Honduras and finished high school, then won a scholarship to study nursing at a university in Tegucigalpa. Her letters described her classes, her goals of working with trafficking survivors, and her gratitude to Abuela Dorothy, whose investigation had given her a future. "I thought I was going to die in that house in Las Vegas," Carmen wrote in one letter. "Every day I prayed for someone to help us, but I didn't believe anyone would come. Then the FBI came with your evidence and your photographs, and I realized someone had been watching. Someone had cared enough to document what was happening to us. You gave me my life back." Dorothy kept all the letters in a box in her bedroom, reading them when she needed reminders that her decision to investigate rather than immediately report had ultimately been the right choice despite the personal cost. Each letter represented a person who was free because Dorothy had spent 6 months gathering evidence. Instead of making one phone call that would have saved a few victims, but left the network intact. The legal proceedings concluded in June 2021, with the last of the trafficking network defendants receiving their sentences. In total, 47 people were convicted on federal charges, with sentences ranging from 15 years to multiple life terms. The Sinaloa cartel connections were disrupted, but not destroyed, as cartels simply rerouted their trafficking operations through different corridors with different contractors. The FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force estimated that Dorothy's investigation had prevented approximately 80 to 100 additional women from being trafficked through the Desert Reapers route. During the year it would have taken to build a case through traditional investigation methods. Agent Lisa Park visited Dorothy in Flagstaff to deliver this estimate and to formally thank her for her assistance. "You understand that we can't officially endorse civilians conducting independent investigations of violent criminal organizations," Park said. But off the record, what you did saved more lives than any trafficking investigation I've worked in 15 years with the Bureau. The evidence you gathered was extraordinary in both quality and courage." Dorothy accepted the thanks, but deflected the praise to a practical concern. "Are my daughter and I safe now? Can we stop looking over our shoulders?" "The immediate threats have been neutralized. Reaper and his leadership are in federal prison. The cartel associates who made threats against you have been arrested or have moved their operations to different regions. We'll maintain monitoring for another 6 months, but our assessment is that you're no longer at significant risk." The relief Dorothy felt at hearing this was profound. For 2 years, she'd lived with awareness that violent people wanted her dead. First, while documenting the Reapers, and then during the investigation and trials. Being told she could finally stop being afraid was like being released from a weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Abuela's kitchen continued to grow through 2021 and 2022. Dorothy hired 2 part-time bakers, both young women from immigrant families who reminded her of herself at their age. She taught them her recipes and her techniques, passing on knowledge she'd accumulated over 50 years of cooking professionally. The bakery became a gathering place for Flagstaff's Latino community, a space where people could find authentic pan dulce and conversation in Spanish. Maria eventually opened a second location near the Northern Arizona University campus, expanding the business, while Dorothy focused on the original bakery and her mentorship of the young bakers. The success felt different from the diner's success, smaller in scale, but somehow more meaningful because it wasn't shadowed by trafficking or violence or constant vigilance against threats. On Dorothy's 75th birthday in March 2022, her family threw a party at the bakery. Her 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren filled the small space, along with regular customers who'd become friends and the FBI agents who'd protected her during the investigation. Agent Park flew in from San Bernardino with a plaque from the FBI director, commending Dorothy's assistance in dismantling a human trafficking network. "This is a rare honor," Park said during a short speech. "The FBI doesn't typically acknowledge civilian assistance this publicly because we don't want to encourage vigilante investigations. But Mrs. Martinez's actions were so extraordinary and her evidence so crucial to our success that the director wanted to ensure her contribution was recognized." Dorothy accepted the plaque graciously, but was more moved by the video messages from several of the recovered trafficking victims who'd sent recordings to be played at the party. Carmen appeared on screen, now 19 and in her nursing scrubs, speaking in Spanish about how Dorothy's courage had inspired her to pursue a career helping other survivors. "Abuela Dorothy taught me that one person who refuses to look away can change everything," Carmen said. "She was just a woman running a diner, but she chose to see what was happening and document it and risk her life to stop it. Because of her, I'm alive. Because of her, I'm in nursing school. Because of her, I have a future. Thank you, Abuela. Te quiero mucho." Dorothy cried, watching the video. The first time Maria had seen her mother break down since Frank's funeral 24 years earlier. The tears were complicated, mixing grief for what she'd witnessed, relief that it was over, pride in what she'd accomplished, and overwhelming gratitude that the victims she'd helped save were building lives worth living. The party continued into the evening with music and dancing and more food than 75 people could possibly eat. Dorothy's grandchildren asked her to tell the story of confronting the bikers, which had become family legend by then, embellished slightly with each retelling. She obliged, describing how Reaper had walked into the diner expecting an old woman to be afraid, and instead found someone who'd survived worse than he could imagine. The thing about living through real violence, Dorothy told her grandchildren, is that it gives you perspective about what's actually scary. Reaper thought 30 bikers would intimidate me, but I'd watched the Sinaloa cartel murder my neighbors when I was a girl. I'd buried a husband I loved. I'd survived cancer. 30 guys on motorcycles making threats. That wasn't scary. That was just Tuesday. Her oldest grandson, a college student studying criminal justice, asked the question others had wondered but been afraid to voice. Weren't you afraid they'd kill you when they found out you'd been documenting them? Of course I was afraid. I was terrified every single day for 6 months. But being afraid and being stopped by fear are different things. I couldn't live with myself if I'd seen what was happening to those girls and done nothing just because I was scared. The honesty of that answer, the acknowledgement that courage didn't mean absence of fear but rather action despite fear, became something her grandchildren remembered and shared with their own friends and eventually their own children. Dorothy ran Abuela's Kitchen for 3 more years before finally retiring at age 78 in 2025. She sold the business to her 2 former apprentices, the young women she'd trained, ensuring that the bakery would continue serving the community she'd grown to love. Maria took over management while Dorothy shifted to a consulting role, coming in a few mornings a week to bake and teach, but no longer carrying the daily burden of running a business. The Desert Reapers Motorcycle Club dissolved in 2023 after most of its leadership was convicted and its assets were seized under federal forfeiture laws. The few remaining members who weren't in prison either joined other clubs or left the motorcycle world entirely. The trafficking route they'd operated was taken over briefly by a different organization, but increased law enforcement attention made it unprofitable and it was eventually abandoned. The Route 40. Diner still operates under new ownership, its history as a trafficking waypoint unknown to current customers who stop there for coffee and pie. Dorothy drove past it once in 2024 while visiting old friends in the area, and she felt nothing looking at the building. It was just a diner again, the way it had been before the Reapers, the way Frank had built it to be. Her legacy lived in other ways. The FBI now includes her case in training materials about civilian cooperation and evidence gathering. Anti-trafficking organizations cite her story in presentations about recognizing and reporting trafficking indicators. And in Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, women who were rescued from the Desert Reapers network tell their families about the grandmother in California who documented their captivity and brought their traffickers to justice. Carmen visited Dorothy in Flagstaff in summer 2025, having saved money from her nursing job to make the trip. She brought photographs of the medical clinic where she worked, treating patients in rural Honduras, including other trafficking survivors. The 2 women spent her afternoon at Abuela's Kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about how life had unfolded in the 6 years since that November night when Dorothy first witnessed victims being held in her storage area. "I think about that night a lot," Carmen said. "Duh. If you had called the police right then, they probably would have rescued me and the other 2 girls. But the Reapers would have just moved their operation somewhere else and kept trafficking. Because you waited and documented, you saved all of us. The ones who came before me and the ones who would have come after." That was brave in a way that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. Dorothy understood what Carmen meant. The immediate rescue would have felt better, would have avoided the guilt of watching victims suffer while documenting their captivity. But the long-term result of dismantling the entire network had saved far more people than one night's intervention would have. "I did what I thought would help the most people," Dorothy said. "I'm not sure it was the right decision, morally, but it was the effective decision." "It was both," Carmen replied. "And because you made it, I'm here. We're all here." That afternoon at the bakery, drinking coffee with a young woman whose life she'd helped save, Dorothy felt something she'd been chasing since the investigation ended. Peace with her choices and their consequences. She'd lost her diner, her old life, her sense of safety, but she'd gained the knowledge that 23 women were free who wouldn't have been, that a trafficking network was destroyed that would have continued operating, that her courage had mattered in ways that would ripple forward for generations. 3 months later, Dorothy passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 78. Her funeral was attended by more than 300 people, including her family, her community from Flagstaff, FBI agents who'd worked her case, and 7 of the trafficking survivors she'd helped rescue who traveled from Central America to pay their respects. Carmen gave a eulogy in Spanish, describing Dorothy as a grandmother to all of us who needed one, a warrior who fought for people she didn't know, and proof that one person who refuses to look away can change the world. Dorothy Martinez's story became part of the training curriculum at the FBI Academy, a case study in civilian courage and the complex ethics of delayed reporting when building larger cases. Her methods weren't officially endorsed, but her results were undeniable. One elderly woman running a diner had documented a trafficking network, risked her life to gather evidence, and ultimately saved dozens of lives while helping dismantle an organization that had operated with impunity for years. The lesson wasn't that civilians should investigate violent criminals. The lesson was that courage shows up in unexpected places, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they decide that injustice matters more than safety, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a grandmother who's survived worse than you can imagine, and decided she's done watching people suffer without fighting back.